Welcome to the next video in the evolution topic. This video will be looking at Evolution of Australian Biota syllabus point 8.5.37. Describe the conditions under which asexual reproduction is advantageous with reference to specific Australian examples. So before we're going to have a look at how asexual reproduction is advantageous, let's do a quick recap on a comparison between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction involves only one parent, where sexual reproduction involves two. Asexual reproduction involves simple mitosis, so cell division, whereas sexual reproduction involves the two different types of cell division that we've already looked at, mitosis and meiosis. So meiosis needs to occur first in order to produce the gametes, so the egg and the sperm. They then need to come together during the process of fertilization, which is our next point here. And then once the egg and the sperm come together, mitosis takes place over and over and over again in order to create the new individual. So yes, sexual reproduction does involve fertilization, whereas asexual reproduction does not. So sexual reproduction is just the coming together of the egg and the sperm with two different parents, whether it be internal or external, as we've already looked at. In asexual reproduction, the offspring are clones of the parents. Because mitosis is what's taking place, we know that mitosis produces two identical cells that are identical to each other and identical to the parent cell. So that's exactly what happens in asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, however, the offspring are a combination of the parent's genes, so we now have a little bit more variation coming in. Asexual reproduction is quite fast and it is a relatively simple process in comparison with sexual reproduction, which is slower, more complicated, and requires a greater amount of energy. Asexual reproduction leads to no variation in the offspring, and therefore the population of that particular species is exactly identical to one another. Whereas sexual reproduction produces variation in the offspring, which can be advantageous in the cases of change, which we've looked at quite a bit over the last few videos. Asexual reproduction is very useful in plant breeding, where large numbers of identical copies are required, and sexual reproduction is useful in breeding where variation is sought. So we know that now there's talk of looking at producing clones in order to maximize on particular characteristics of animal populations. So we still have the idea of sexual reproduction producing the desired characteristics in the first place, but then looking at the possibilities of using asexual reproduction to produce more numbers of that particular organism. That's something that we'll look at further down the track in the Year 12 course. So asexual reproduction, what are the advantages and disadvantages? So asexual reproduction is advantageous where there are few individuals left who are able to recolonize an area. So this can happen when the adult plant is destroyed, in particular after fire. So we know in Australia, in the last 50,000 years, the incidence of fire has increased dramatically, and this has meant that plant species need to be able to deal with that. So having the ability to reproduce asexually means that if a whole population of plants was destroyed, and there's only a few individuals left, those few individuals are able to completely recolonize an area. So this allows organisms to take advantage of a sudden or temporary change towards favorable environmental conditions. Now, a disadvantage, as we've already looked at, is that there is limited variety amongst the offspring. So if the environment were to change again dramatically in the future, there is less chance of that species surviving because of natural selection. There's less variation in the population. Those that are still around may not have that particular trait that is necessary to survive in the new environmental change, so they don't reach reproductive age, and therefore the whole species disappears or becomes extinct. So some Australian species where asexual reproduction is advantageous include the bracken fern, which we talked about in the last video, which can spread and regenerate after fire because majority of those roots are underneath the soil, so they can withstand the temperatures. The Sturt desert pea sends out runners when conditions are optimal, allowing a single plant to rapidly produce dozens of offspring. So obviously from their name, we can see that they live in a desert environment. So during those wetter seasons when there's more water available, they're able to maximize those conditions and produce large numbers of offspring. Colony wattles, again, the image in the middle, we can see that they grow in desert areas, send up shoots from outer roots which grow into separate plants should the parent plant die, which allows for rapid regeneration. Royal robe in the fourth picture here is ground cover that can reproduce asexually to recolonize damaged areas such as sand dunes. And lastly, some eucalyptus forests are deliberately burnt in order to encourage seedling growth. So the seeds fall, they don't grow until they sort of come in contact with very high temperatures. And this was a nice quick short one, and that brings us to the end of this video. So thank you for watching.